Welcome everyone. This little PowerPoint is going to go through the very basics of the history of ceramics kind of around the world. I want to emphasize this is not a comprehensive history of ceramics. This is super bare bones, and we're just going to kind of hit some of the major topics and time periods throughout the history of ceramics. We're going to kind of keep it in a about chronological order. Little things are going to be happening around the same time, as this is kind of ceramics throughout history. There's not necessarily dates, but time periods. So some of those time periods are going to overlap and that sort of thing. But let's go ahead and get started. So the very first functional fired pottery are these pieces from Japan, starting about 14,000 years ago, but some people claim that it's much longer ago than that. It was made by the Jomon people, and therefore it's called Jomonware. Literally meaning cord wrapped is what Jomonware means. Like I said, these are some of the oldest known ceramic artifacts and the first functional pottery pieces around. Not only are the Jomon people known for making these highly intricate ceramic pieces, they're one of the oldest cultures to rely on ceramics. This really started to show how cultures began to use ceramic pieces and the functional pieces that they made to kind of further their own society. In general, making of ceramics, especially with these Jomon pieces, represent a shift away from the hunter-gatherer mode and more into human society as we know it today, a more stationary, sedentary lifestyle based on communities that stay in place. This piece from China during the Shang Dynasty, about 1700 BCE, is another kind of time period that's really well represented in history, in that as the Jomon pieces marked a change from hunter-gatherer lifestyle to more of a farming lifestyle, this piece represents one in human history in which people began to become tradespeople, in that before this, everyone had to do everything, right? That you made your own pottery, you grew your own food, you raised your own animals, you cooked your own food, all of these things, but you did your own leather work. But at this point in time, it really marks a move to more of a trade-centered society. So there were people that were professionals. That means that there were blacksmiths, leatherworks, professional potters, etc., etc. This piece in particular is a Shangware pottery piece, obviously. It's a white pottery. It's a stoneware pottery clay that's very fine-grained, but fires very white. It was fired in a kiln to about 1,850 degrees, which is about the same temperature that we bisque fire to. The ability for Chinese potters at this point to get their work fired to that temperature was really extraordinary and really moved the ceramic process forward, in that these pieces now are far less porous than they were before and lasted a much longer time. This piece in particular is an example of that, and the whole series of pots made at that time are really known as kind of a forerunner to porcelain, which, as we'll get into, is really what a lot of Chinese potters are famous for. So now we're going to head over to Greece, about a few hundred years after those pieces from the Shang Dynasty. When we think of ancient pottery, often many of us think of Greek and Roman pottery pieces, and this is one of them. There are two main areas in Greece at this time that were making pots. This is from the Minoan Islands, and at this point they were certainly kind of more further ahead in their development of their ceramics than the mainland islands, which we'll get to in a second. This piece is known as a marine style piece. As you can see, there's a large octopus on it, and most of their pieces were highly decorated with images from the sea life that they had. The Minoan people were mostly fishermen and women because they lived on this little island. This piece and most of the pieces at the time were inspired by frescoes. As you can see, the entire surface of the pot was covered, and this octopus tends to wrap around everything. It also is against a background of rocks and seaweed. And you can kind of see that this is a kind of all-over pattern, which is really different than other things, that there's very little wasted negative space. The marine style is a lot more free-flowing than a lot of the pottery at this time, with no distinct zones, which is different than this style of pottery, which is from mainland Greece, again, a few hundred years after the marine style, or at least that piece in particular. The first painted Greek pottery on mainland Greece is referred to as protogeometric, which was very loose patterns, wavy lines. Many of the Greek paintings and some of the frescoes even have been lost over time. So a lot of the knowledge that we have about Greek art is assumed from studying earlier Greek pots. So after the proto-geometric style of Greek pottery became this more geometric style, it became popular as kind of a response to the marine style with its free-flowing design from that style. It also broke with representation of the Minoan and Mycenaean periods in that these are just mostly, although this piece does have some animal forms on it, really was just a representation of design. And then as we continue through the history of Greek ceramics, we're going to be coming to pieces that are pieces that we really think of when we think of Greek ceramics, with highly intricate designs, a lot of images of people, a lot of images of wartime, eating, celebrating, that sort of thing. The first style of this is called black figure pottery. It was really one of the most popular styles in ancient Greece for many, many years. The real high point of Greek ceramics, although here the rough is 1000 to 300 BC, between the years of around 620 to 480, 450 BC is when there was really the high point in this black figure technique. The technique is of inside silhouetted figures with really kind of enlivened designs than just very plain designs. This style of painting was really a Corinthian invention in the 7th century, and then from here it spread from Corinthia to many of the other Greek cities and states, Sparta, Eurovia, etc., and then all the way out to Athens. After the black figure period became the red figure period in Greek ceramics. The technique of making these figures is super interesting. No one totally agrees on the exact process in which these pieces were made, but potters at this period learned how to control the application of their slips so that they were able to paint directly onto the surface rather than having to incise, carve away the designs like they did in the black figure. So this piece is super smooth, there's no carving into it, while the black figure pottery there was. This is really the last major achievement in Greek pottery, and soon after this style was developed, the Greeks really stopped producing any pieces of significance. They also, at this point, were going to many wars, and soon the Roman Empire was going to kind of come on through. Well, most people don't totally agree on the exact firing process. Most do believe that it was involved a multi-step firing process in which the pieces were fired to temperature, and during that same firing or a separate one, the pieces were brought down to a lower temperature and then reduced, so the smoke was trapped in the kiln to create a really high carbon atmosphere, and that is what made these pieces black. There was a different type of slip or surface that was put on the areas that were to maintain the redness, and those wouldn't absorb the carbon in the atmosphere while the rest of the piece would. So you can see on this piece here that there are certain areas that are totally very deep dark black, while there's others that tend to be more of a rusty color around the figure there. This is from the uneven absorption of carbon in this high reduction atmosphere in the kiln during that firing process. While we often think of Egypt and the pyramids, they also were very proficient potters. And although they made a lot of functional pots, they are also known for their relatively unique canopic jars. Most of the burial wares used in Egypt were fired at a lower temperature than most of the pottery, both in Egypt and other places around the world. As far as I know, the Egyptians were really the first people to use sprig molds and other two-piece molds to a high extent. So along with these canopic jars, they also made a lot of cast pieces that were cast in different molds and then joined together. So such as, pieces with camels or other animals that they would also put in the tomb or in the burial with the person. What's really interesting is that they would use the molds for the main shapes, and then they would assemble the figures and then hand carve them so that they were really individualized and highly decorated, which is pretty cool. Well, we've talked a little bit about these canopic jars. Many of the canopic jars were initially made of stone and wood, but then as the Egyptians became more proficient potters, they started to make these jars out of more of a high fire porcelain as the technology reached them. We'll find out soon that it wasn't at 900 BCE, but a little bit later that they started to use more porcelain. So Sioux pottery is a major pottery time period in Japan, although it's believed to have originated in the 5th or 6th century in the Kaya region of southern Korea and then moved to Japan. It was a contemporary with native or from Japan Hanchi pottery, which was more porous and reddish color. This is a type of pottery that was made of coils of clay, much like other pottery at the time. Coil building is one that has been throughout ceramic history, starting with those Jomon pieces. As the coils were made, the pieces were then beaten and smoothed and then carved into shape. Many kilns at that time were fired with wood, and so you would get this wood ash firing. This was the first type of pottery that in Japan they reached those temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius, or that 1850 degrees Fahrenheit that we were talking about with the Shang Dynasty Chinese work. So in general, these pots were totally unglazed, but sometimes these pots got an accidental covering of ash on them, which you can see on this piece here, that you can kind of see how this pot would have been fired on its side, and so the ash would have hit that one surface on the left of this pot, but it would have been oriented so that we're standing upright. And then the ash would build up and then run and drip. You can see kind of in the middle left portion of this piece, there's a section that is a little bit lighter than the rest of the ash pieces, right in there. So in China, the first emperor of unified China, which I'm sure I will get the name totally wrong, Qin Shi Huang, was buried in this mausoleum with the terracotta army. This is one of the kind of new wonders of the world, and it's really, really incredible. It is believed that it took 700,000 men to construct it, and at the time, the number of people were buried in this mausoleum with the first emperor was larger than any city in the world at that time. Each figure that you see here is totally unique, and they vary in height from 6 feet to 6'5" tall, so they were a little bigger than life size. And these pieces were, these individual pieces were made so that the tallest pieces, the tallest individuals were the generals, working down to other figures that were warriors or peasants or other individuals in that community at that time. While you see many, many human figures, there also were chariots, horses, musicians, all kinds of different figures that were put in this mausoleum. Current estimates are that there are 3 different pits that include over 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, 520 horses, and 150 cavalry. The majority of these are still buried in the pits, and as far as I understand it, China every so often will open it back up to digging out more of the pieces. If you start paying attention, you'll start to see some of these pieces in museums that you go to. There are many individual figures scattered throughout the world, and they really are totally incredible. The amount of detail that were on these is insane, and every single piece is totally unique. The assumption is that every piece legitimately represented a specific individual. Now, while these pieces are relatively drab colored, that terracotta or brown coloring, it's believed that every one of these pieces also was highly decoratively painted so that it really looked lifelike when you approached it at that time. It's really an incredible, incredible feat of human engineering and craftsmanship. So now we're moving to the Han Dynasty China, which is right when we're kind of moving from or moving into the Common Era. So it's believed that some of the first true porcelaneous wares were made in the Zhejiang province during the Han Dynasty. Their porcelain and stoneware are both clay bodies that both have similar makeups. Porcelain is clay, stoneware is clay, but so exactly the difference between porcelain and stoneware is often argued. But it's believed that these are the first true porcelains. They were able to be fired to higher temperatures than any stoneware at the time. So we were talking about that 1850 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, they're firing well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And while that doesn't sound like a lot of temperature, it really totally changes the clay body. This specific image is of a hunping, or a soul jar, like the Egyptians had the Kanopi jars. This was a funerary jar from China. You can also see how much more highly decorated this pottery is starting to become than a lot of the more simple decorations previously. So this is a typical, or some typical examples of pottery of the Tang Dynasty in China. So now we've really come into the common area between 600 and 900 CE. These pots are often decorated with what is referred to as the Senkai style glaze. In general, there were three colors, most commonly green, white, and yellow to brown. Often it's referred to as spinach and eggware as a description of those three colors in combination with themselves. These pieces, we were just talking about how that Han Dynasty started making porcelains. This again is an kind of rebuttal in reference to that. These pieces are low fire work, but with this type of glazing process, you would still be able to get that highly decorated ceramic imagery, but in a much less extensive and expensive style of glazing. You can kind of see how these pieces are able to be decorated so specifically because they are lead glazed, and lead in ceramics makes a super stable glaze that doesn't move a lot. This piece on the right, you can kind of see it may have been made like this, or it may have been overfired too hot and that all the decorations melted down. We don't use lead anymore because we know of how its poisonous nature, but at this time the lead allowed people to make really, really intricate glazing processes. And as opposed to just the jars, there also were many sculptures that were made as well. So, as we move throughout China, as you can see, China is a huge area in the development through ceramic history. A lot of the major developments in ceramics happened in China. So at this point, the Song Dynasty has started to make true Celadon glazes. What I mean by that are that these glazes are glazes that are fired to high temperatures. So now even above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, we're getting up to 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And these pieces are fired in a reduction atmosphere. The gray and green Celadons that we see here are derived by iron and the way that iron undergoes changes during the firing and reduction in the kiln. What happens is that the iron goes from ferric to ferrous as it loses oxygen because that carbon is pulling it out. This means that the range of temperatures in a kiln can vary totally widely. In general, when we think of iron as a color in ceramics, it's yellows and browns, but in this reduction atmosphere with these Celadon glazes, you can get a huge range of greens to blues. It's thought that the Chinese at this time were trying to mimic the look and color of jade that they were often using a lot of in their sculpture. So the first type of pieces that these Celadon glazes were used on were called Yuware. These pieces were not in fact porcelain that many were using in China at this time, but on a gray stoneware. That's what this little dish to the right is. It's often why the colors are not quite as bright. So these Celadon glazes were able to show this huge range of color, but because of this more buff stoneware, the range of glazes is much less. You can kind of see on this piece, on the right, this little dish, that you get more of the traditional, or not traditional, but assumed color of iron in your kiln, this kind of yellow to brown color. But again, with porcelains and with this reduction atmosphere to a really high temperature, you can get more of this range of colors into the jade kind of spectrum, like this porcelain vase on the left. So now we're back to Japan, and you can kind of see how these pieces can really be thought of moving off of that Su pottery. This is called Shigaraki ware. While they look like Su pottery, they also are fired much like Su pottery. and so fired in a wood kiln. But these pieces were assumed to be much more straightforward in their form, a lot more simple, although that Su piece we looked at was very simple. These are really thought of to be very functional pieces. You're going to see again the ash buildup on these two pieces. The piece on the right at the top rim, where that color goes a little bit more brown than red, is the ash buildup and running off the piece. And then on this larger base to the left, you can see a little darker spot on it where the ash has hit and run down. As opposed to that Su pottery piece where you could really kind of see how it was very crusty, you can start to see how the ash on these pieces is becoming much more glossy, more like a glaze. That's because at this time, Japanese potters were able to get their kilns firing to a hotter temperature, so the ash was really melting, really creating a glaze on the surface. So now we're moving to the Middle East a little bit, where the use of glazed ceramics was totally, very highly prevalent in Islamic art, often making really, really elaborate pottery pieces. So we were talking about how the Sankai period in China, that they were using lead glazes to make highly decorative pieces because those lead glazes are really, really stable. One of the new technologies developed by Islamic potters at that time were to do very similar glazes, but with tin glazes, with tin opacifying the glaze and making it more stable. Some of the first Islamic opaque glazes that from this tin process were blue painted ware in Basra, dating to around the 8th century, so even a little bit before this piece in specific. Another big development in the Middle East were these really, really deep blues and the use of cobalt in their glazes, as well as the use of a more vitreous or semi-vitreous ceramic ware with really fine clay texture, so a much finer type of stoneware than was seen before, and that was made and used in Iraq around the 9th century. So, between 13 and 1600 CE, the Ming Dynasty were making pots. At this point, they were capitalizing on trade routes that had recently formed from China through the Middle East all the way to Europe. They were really capitalizing on European designer for fine oriental porcelains with these highly intricate designs. There was a period of time where these type of porcelains were rivaled to the value of gold, and the Chinese potters at that time were obviously more than willing to provide porcelain goods in vast quantities to Europe. You can start to see also that these pieces have that dark blue that we were just talking about in the Middle East. So as these trade routes opened, Chinese potters were able to get some of that cobalt from the Middle East to start using on their own pottery. This opening up trade routes and the wanting of art pieces and functional wares from other cultures really started to move the world into a more global economy. It's pretty crazy to think that one of the major kind of forces in creating a global economy was the wanting of ceramics throughout history, and while there are many other things that were sought after, at this point, these highly intricate pottery and ceramic pieces were one of the major forces in that, along with the materials that they needed to move throughout the world. At the same time that the Ming Dynasty were kind of capitalizing on that European desire for intricate pottery pieces. The Korean potters were also trying to innovate and make these intricate designs, although in their own style. In some respect, these pieces that you see here, these Mabyong vases, are carrying some of the ideals of the Song dynasty China, with really quiet but expressive forms and a very refined surface. These types of vases, these Mabyong vases, are just one type of pottery that the Koreans were involved with, but in many respects represent the height of the refinement and influences potters. Around this time, in the Byungcheong region, I'm so sorry about all these names that I'm totally mispronouncing, Korean potters were beginning to more highly develop the technique we now refer to as Mishima, which is a Japanese word, but it is the incising of slip. So these intricate designs, rather than painted on the surface of your pot or painted with glaze, much like the Chinese potters were doing at the time, these pieces were done by incising lines, carving away the clay, and then putting slip on the surface. So each one of these little, let's say, white lines or white designs is totally carved out, and then a white slip was put on and then carved away. And the same was done with that black slip. You can start to see, especially on this vase to the left, down near the bottom, how some of the lines go from more solid to much lighter, and that's as that slip was carved away to reveal the design that was put on the piece, that it was either gone too deep or that carving line wasn't made thick enough or deep enough so that you lose that line a little bit. But these are really amazing examples of that Mishima process. So we haven't talked much about Italian pottery up until this point, and actually we won't talk about Italian pottery much, but the Italians, especially during and late in the Renaissance, really fed off of this Islamic and Middle Eastern glazing process with these tin glazes. The Italians kind of further developed this process into what we now refer to as Maiolica glazes, and this is an example of that, where you have a glaze, and then with that same glaze you color it and then paint on the surface with it to reveal these very specific, highly decorative glaze process that's very painterly and pretty cool. So another is kind of amazing example of the ceramic pieces that were coming out of the Middle East were the Iznik style or Iznik pottery. It's a pretty good example of kind of the technical innovations at the time, and is also kind of an interesting study in geography. So this plate on the left is one of those examples of Iznik pottery. The Middle East at the point, we talked about they kind of were innovators in cobalt, but they were also being influenced by the work of both Europe and Asia at this time. So this piece on the left, you can kind of see there's a relationship to a lot of the porcelains of China with this highly intricate blue design process, but also the decorative traditions of Europe. A lot of the imagery is more European and the style is more Chinese. Should also be noted that this piece here is not actually porcelain, but again Maiolica, that tin glazing process that was developed in the Middle East, used in Italy, but also continued to be used in the Middle East. And like we said, this is a tradition that kind of still continues today. So this Meissen porcelain, or Meissen china, was the first European hard paste porcelain. It was developed starting in around 1708 by Ehrenfried Walther von Tschirnhaus. Say that name twice fast. So this is a hard paste porcelain, which we refer to as true porcelains, opposed to soft paste porcelain, which is porcelains made by adding just ground glass to white stoneware and white kaolin. And while that soft paste glass porcelain was fired much lower temperature, this hard paste that they were able to develop made adding pentutes or like China stone, like a feldspar or feldspathic rock to white china clay allowed Europeans their first venture into true porcelains, those porcelains that can get fired to that 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, while staying really white and even translucent in many cases. So this Kutani ware from Japan are some of the most highly decorated ceramics throughout the history of Japan, and it also was their first venture into porcelains. With this piece in particular, or at least this close-up, you can really see the influences that Japan also was taking from both China, the Middle East, and Europe at that time. This also led into other of their painting techniques, including their calligraphy and watercolor work that you can kind of see in some of their other pieces. So our venture continues up into the Netherlands and into another style of Maiolica. In this case, this is specifically called Delftware or Delft pottery, made by that company or those potters. Delftware is really known as being a white tin glazed pottery made in Netherlands with this very specific blue, although it looks much like many of the other cobalt blues that we talked about, called Delft blue. This is, like I said, the Maiolica process, so it's white tin glazes and slips on top of earthenware or low fire bodies, then decorated with metal oxides, both mixed in with the glaze and by themselves, and with these specifically cobalt. It's obviously also part of that larger family of blue and white pottery that stems from China into the Middle East, into Europe at that time. Delftware is often mostly seen on really functional pieces and tiles, the most highly regarded and intricate of those being in production around 1640 to 1740. This piece on the left I think is interesting. It's a tulipier. As many of us know, that the Dutch were really well known for their flowers, specifically tulips, for a long time, as a lot of the European economy was based around tulips. And so this is specifically a piece designed to display your tulips. One flower would go in each of those little spouts and would be a centerpiece on your table. The top kind of comes off so you can fill it with water. Pretty crazy, if I do say so myself. So we're just going to talk a little bit about French, like a sentence here. The French were, again, kind of moving along with most of the Europeans. Not a lot of technological advances came directly from France in ceramics, but these pieces are starting to use some decals and gold lusters on their pieces. This also was the first French national porcelain factory, so the first French porcelain in this factory here in Sèvres. So then we're going to move to Europe and take a look at this type of pottery developed by Josiah Wedgwood in the 1760s. This, as we're getting closer to our current day, this Wedgwood pottery is still in existence, and a lot of the pieces are referred to as jasperware. So I was saying before, the difference between stoneware and porcelain, it's kind of a gray area as the transition from stoneware to porcelain. And so it's relatively argued as to whether or not this jasperware clay body is a porcelain or a stoneware. Honestly, it doesn't matter too much, but it's sort of interesting. Most of the pottery pieces that come out of Wedgwood are ware that is matte and has no glazed surface, the most common of which is this blue, which has now become known as Wedgwood blue. Relief decorations, generally in white, but also there could be other colors depending on the piece, are characteristic of Wedgwood jasperware. They are made by using sprig molds, little molds that the clay is pushed into and then taken out of and then applied to the surface, along with many of the additions made in that same way. So this piece is unglazed, it is colored clay. So the colorants that are used in glazes can also be used to color clay. That clay will then have this surface, which is how this Wedgwood blue came about. So those are kind of the major traditions of pottery through like the major channels and a lot of the pottery kind of evolutions. But that being said, there are tons and tons and tons of other ceramic traditions throughout the world. They often were just not involved in the major trade routes, so the pottery isn't influenced by those of other cultures. One of these is Zuni Pueblo pottery, and it's made of using clay that is used both the natural clay body and uses crushed pottery shards or rocks to temper it to give it kind of an unfinished white pottery look, kind of like that of a lot of the like European white stonewares. Often, when Zuni Pueblo pottery artists paint a black or red slip onto their pieces and then carve through it. And so you can kind of see this process of digging the clay in the upper left and mixing it in with other pieces in the upper right, and then their making of the pieces in the lower left and middle there, painting the slips on. Often Zuni Pueblo artists create a lot of open bowls and pottery baskets, many of them with rims and then kind of decorated with painted or carved animal designs. So one major tribe in Africa that has done a lot of ceramics throughout their history is the Ashanti pottery from the Mangbetu tribe in Zaire. They're really kind of masters of adding design to their pieces. Most of the pottery pieces that come from Africa are functional in nature, but only provide more decorative pieces as skills grew throughout different tribes, from adding slips to burnishing to adding extra pieces like those seen in these pieces here. One thing that's interesting to me is that this piece to the left with this handle joining two spouts is often referred to as a stirrup vessel, and most pottery traditions have this very specific two-spouted handled vessel in their ceramic tradition. And no one knows exactly why this very specific piece developed, but it did. Here you can see some examples of South American pottery. The earliest known ceramics from the Americas has been found in kind of the lower Amazon basin around Brazil. Specifically from the Caverna de Pedra Pintada near Santarém, Brazil, and they're roughly dated from like 5 to 3,000 or 5,000 to 3,000 BCE. Some of these pieces and why we know they're dating were shell tempered. So it allows the shards to be kind of radiocarbon dated, which is pretty interesting. The first ceramic cultures in South America that were making pots at the time were both fishers and shellfish gatherers, much like the Minoans at that time. And here in the upper right, you can kind of see another example of one of those, albeit more intricate, but stirrup vessels there. One of the major pottery traditions in North America is the Anasazi pottery. It tends to be constructed of white or gray clay and is generally made with pinch or mostly coils that are coiled together and then scraped. Early, these traditions were often decorated with black geometric designs, but later more polychrome types were developed, some of which are more ancestral to like Hopi pottery, which many have heard of. Zuni Pueblo pottery is again made of those shards to temper it and coated in like a red or black slip. A lot of the Anasazi work is work that is kind of the pieces in the middle two pieces here, where they are made and then highly burnished, rubbed when the clay is just right, both with a slip or without. Often they do use graphite to help as a lubricant. While these pieces are black, it is not because of the graphite that's on them that would burn off in the firing, but because that these pieces are also fired in a reduction kiln, much like those Greek pots that we were talking about earlier, so that those pieces absorb that carbon and that's what makes them black. And again, no glaze on these, so that glossiness that you see on the pieces is from the burnishing of kind of like flattening and aligning the silica particles of the clay. Where there's more of a matte surface, that was very lightly carved away to take the very surface of the burnished off to leave more of a matte surface and the designs under it. The last kind of thing we're going to talk about is the American pottery movement, which is a movement that had developed from a tradition of individual potters making utilitarian earthen and stoneware vessels for local use that dates all the way back to the colonial period. Depending geographically where those potters were, it was shaped to different degrees by their specific locations, what was necessary for the communities, and the individual potter's appreciation for Native American pottery traditions. What's known as American stoneware is a pretty specific type of stoneware pottery, most popular in the 19th century in North America. It was pretty much the predominant houseware of that time, usually fired in a salt kiln, decorated using cobalt oxide to provide and produce bright and blue decorations. So if you've ever seen those traditional American pottery jars and flasks that are kind of white to grayish with blue decorations, that's what we're talking about. They're also generally fired in wood kilns, but the addition of salt is added to create more of a smooth glazing surface and create more of that flux. Another big tradition of those American stoneware is the use of Albany slip. So like this jug in the top middle, that it could also, this is a modern representation of those pieces, but they're also traditional ones that are very similar, with that bottom half being that salt glazed surface, that tan to white color with some orange peel effects often. The top is often an Albany slip that is a slip, a natural occurring clay from Albany, New York at this time. That mine is totally mined out, and we have no more access to Albany slip, so there are no more pieces that can be made like this specifically because we have totally exhausted our supply of this Albany slip. The US has a pretty big tradition of naturally occurring clays and stonewares that we have mined here in the US from the evolution and then erosion of our mountains and things down into stream beds, from more coarse clay bodies all the way to fine ones as you get further and further out. Pottery in itself is one that's been an integral part to the American arts and crafts movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. Charles Fergus Binns, who was one of the first directors of the New York State School of Clay and working at ceramics at specifically Alfred University, was a really important influence on that. Alfred University is now one of the larger clay and ceramic schools in the country. A lot of potters adopted the approach of emerging studio pottery movements in Britain and Japan, in addition to the American folk pottery of the southwestern United States was seen as kind of a American contribution to studio pottery. Don Reitz is someone who introduced scallop glazing to the curriculum at Alfred in around 1959-1960, and subsequently it spread to other American universities, and then along with these ceramic art traditions. Functional pottery was not one that was seen as something that should be involved with art schools for a long time, and I've had friends that have taken years abroad in other countries to work on functional pots, and a lot of the other art schools around the world don't see functional pottery as an addition to their art school, but more of a craft movement, while in the US specifically, we have a very, very strong tradition as the American crafts and craft movement as art, which is pretty cool. And this development from potters like Don Reitz at Alfred and many, many others, Peter Baucus, Paul Sodner, you can go on and on and on, Warren McKenzie, really crossed and the divide between crafts and fine art to really bring it all back into one, which is often why we are here today. In general, that kind of concludes this very brief venture into ceramic history. Again, it covers very much the basics of ceramics throughout time, kind of hitting only on some of the major occurrence. But it gives you kind of a general idea for how long we've been doing this as a culture, both in America and worldwide, and how much more there is to continue to evolve upon. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great day.